Hi guys, we have Priya Seth with us today. She is a great DOP and an underwater cinematographer. Priya, I'm not going to take any more time in introducing you because everyone here pretty much knows you. But I would really like to know what your early influences were. Like what led you to do underwater cinematography, which is so unusual.
Actually, I think I came upon underwater cinematography quite by accident, which I've said earlier, because I was a camera assistant at that point, and one inadvertent day bumped into Prahlad Kakkar, the great Prahlad Kakkar, somewhere in an elevator, and he basically yelled at me and said that all us young assistants have no responsibility towards the future. We're going to have this thing called underwater cinematography, and it should be a great opportunity for me. And people like us should go there and try and do this because it's something new and interesting and great. And I was always a very, I like physical activity. I used to be a sports person. So it was something that sounded really exciting because, so I went and learned how to dive. Actually, Vishnu and I went and learned how to dive. And then in a month of certifying, when we were green behind our ears, knew absolutely nothing, we were thrown into a shoot in Lakshadweep in the deep sea with monsoon 1 month away, not knowing how to control ourselves, forget to control the camera. And we just learned with Anis actually. It was trial by fire, went in there. And it was just actually the greatest gift I think I ever received was being able to dive and shoot and to combine the two because there's something very, very therapeutic about it.
Very, and when that happened, when he did recommend that you go ahead and do underwater cinematography, what were you doing just before that?
I was still assisting. At that point, I was assisting Gopal Shah for advertising work. But in between, what I would do is I would still go off and do a lot of feature assisting on international projects. Because Gopal didn't do any features and I didn't know anybody else. So I worked on Earth, Deepa Mehta's Earth. I assisted Giles Nutkins. I assisted the great Dion Beatty on Holy Smoke. There were another couple of projects. So I would take off, keep doing those films and then coming back and working in advertising. I did a few jobs with Anil Mehta as well. So I was assisting at that point, like in the thick of it.
Okay. And are you trained at a film school or you pretty much learned on the job?
I pretty much learned on the job. I'd done a very short course in New York, which was barely about 3 months in 1997. And I think that was far more just a reassurance that this is something I wanted to explore. I don't think it really teaches you anything at that point, but it just gave me some insight and a little opening into what the world would be like and where I wanted to go with it. So I came back after that, started working with, again, Gopal in 1998. Because at that point, there were very few cinematographers who had women assistants and there were very few women assistants. So that was a large marker actually to say where somebody would even accept someone like me. And Shanti at that point was working with Gopal. And that's how it started actually. Somebody recommended me and said, he's got a female assistant and maybe so he'll be open to hiring you or having you even come on as an intern. So that's how it started.
And see, when I started off, people were, which was in 2005, people were still sort of would find it strange to see women behind the camera, so to say. I wonder how it was when you started off. Like, what was it that you were dealing with?
I very soon learned to feel like an animal inside a cage because the minute you walked onto set and they saw a light meter tucked into your waist belt, people just stared at me like I was some sort of alien. So that was that. So I really never saw anybody for many, many years. I was an oasis in this place. It was, I can't say it was tough because I think advertising is where I cut my teeth and people there are slightly more evolved. So no one actually said it to your face. But on the first few jobs that I went, and I was a scrawny reed, like I was really very, very skinny. And of course, the first questions that you get are, can you pick this crane weight up? Can you do that? It's all about heavy lifting. Like no one's really interested in whether you have any brain.
And interestingly, I just feel like there isn't so much heavy lifting for DPs to do. There is always so many people around you taking things off you within seconds of finishing a shot. I don't know why they make such a big deal out of that.
Exactly. So, and it becomes all about that. They make physicality of cinematography such an integral part of it when, as you're saying, it actually is not that important. And that's what becomes this barrier, right? It's like, will you be able to lift this? Will you be able to spend an 18-hour day? That's not what the work is about. But that's what's become enshrined as what is, cinematography.
And so I have this particular question for you, which one couldn't ask anyone else, is that because you're a DP yourself, you've done 3 features, you've done multiple ads. When you go onto somebody else's set as an underwater DP, what part of your aesthetics do you sort of, because people have, when there's a Steadicam operator or a Jimmy Jib operator, we would usually tell them that this is a particular shot that we want to take. Okay, but with an underwater DP, you're the eyes for the DP underwater. I mean, of course, they have a feed up there, but there's a lot that you're bringing in. They don't know how much they need to ask you to move left or right or go close. So, how
That's
much of
really
yourself do you bring in?
That's a very interesting question. Only could come from a DP actually. So I think when I was younger and when I just started doing it, obviously there was a big gap between the senior DPs and myself. I was still, so it was, it was collaborative, but there was still a little bit of deference because it was still their job and, I was still new and younger and a bit reticent about what I was doing. And I think it's such, I love doing it now because now what's happened is I'm working with equals. And it's become collaborative. And I think even for a DP, it's very exciting to have another person on set who you can actually, we never get that experience otherwise. To work with another DP, to just like thrash ideas, let's do a lighting plan. Otherwise you're working with assistants or with your crew. But I was just working, in fact, with the last 2-3 jobs. I did one with Anay recently. I did another one for Mardani 2 with Jishnu. And the greatest part of those jobs for me was being collaborative with DPs, and I think it was mutual for both of us, for all of us, because it obviously makes the work better, but and the exchange and the excitement where you can gossip on set with the DP, you can stuff, you basically have all this tech porn that you're exchanging, which you can never really do. So I'm enjoying it much more now.
And another technical question on that front, because you as a DP light above water, you light in air and you light underwater with the light coming in through the water, and the refraction and all of that is so different. What is it? I mean, does your style change particularly when you're shooting above water or underwater in terms of contrast or, how would the softness of light?
Shooting through water is very, very tricky because you have another medium and another variable. And it changes on every shoot because it depends on whether you're on the sea or in a pool, how deep the pool, how clean the pool, day, night, soft light, hard light. So there are so many variables that go into shooting underwater that you really have to dig into every bit of experience and try and imagine what that's going to be, taking into account all the vagaries that could exist. So lighting underwater is a very different skill. Like, it's an extremely different skill because whatever you assume above water, nothing really works out. And you're constantly, what happens is also because in India, we don't really have such a professional watertight setup underwater. We're working in various pools. Some days the filtration doesn't work. Some days you're 2 days away from the monsoon. So you have to be very, very alert and aware. And a large part of it is firefighting and problem solving, while just knowing, like, you know that, okay, now this is what's happened, this is what's going wrong, and you just are constantly adapting. So it's also very hard to communicate and teach someone how this works because it just comes from so much experience of going through so many underwater shoots. And really we say that about all our shoots, but on underwater shoots, it's like literally the canvas is changing every few hours. So how I start out at the beginning of the day with what water clarity, and what happens by the afternoon, how it changes the visibility, changes the way I'm going to light. So you're constantly adapting. So it's completely different.
And obviously, because you do underwater, I'm sure you enjoy diving and stuff. What are your favorite diving locations?
Oh gosh, the only diving locations I've been to in the last 3 years, shamefully, and Anis gives me a lot of grief for, is Khopoli, outside of Lonavala, because there's this deep pool that we keep shooting in. But otherwise, I think one of my favorite locations diving has been Komodo, which was a liveaboard trip that we did on a boat. And the other one was, let me guess, Oman, Malaysia. I mean, there's so many actually, The thing with diving is that it takes you to parts of the world that you wouldn't ordinarily get to see because there's nothing else to do in those parts. So you really get to see these little jewel islands all over the world.
And in terms of films, Fawzia had that question. Which are the real locations that you've shot in for films underwater?
We've shot in actually quite a lot. Maldives, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Goa, Malaysia.
Can you name the films?
Yeah. Can I name some? I don't know. These are, I think Malaysia was a commercial. It was a Maruti commercial that we went to Malaysia to shoot. And there was this film that we shot in Lakshadweep that was our first job actually, which called Phir Zindagi by Parvati Rajgopalan with Milind Soman and Gulpanag. That was the first ever job. And remember, when we started shooting underwater, we would shoot on film cameras. We had 35mm cameras.
Of course. Anish is here, by the way. He's joined us.
So we would take film cameras down with 4.5-minute mags. And now I think about it, it's absolute madness because you're going into the ocean with a 4-minute mag and trying to, shoot God knows what. And every 4 minutes you're getting this camera out, reloading in a boat with a changing bag. Like it was absolutely crazy that we did that. So now it's become a lot simpler with digital, but that was extremely tricky.
And there is a question that somebody had asked me to ask you. I'm gonna. So, what are your what is the prep that goes into an underwater shoot specifically?
So that's this is something we're trying to constantly educate. Anis and I educate everybody about. We have this sheet that we prepare. The few things that one has to take care of course, before we even begin discussing what the storyboard is, to see the clarity of the water. Again, if our canvas is polluted, there's nothing we can do about it because we keep getting this question: can't you do something in post, or can't you fix something on the Alexa, or there's nothing we can do. It literally is like a sensor. It's another kind of a thing. So if the water clarity is not correct, then there's nothing that we can do. So that is the first thing that we are so adamant about, is show us the pool, let us approve the pool. Once I know what kind of pool and what the situation is, if it's a day shoot or a night shoot, scene, direct light, soft light, then we start designing the light, keeping in mind what the clarity of the water is. Because sometimes I realize that suppose it's meant to be a dirty lake and the water isn't that clean. Now if we start using very heavy backlight in those situations, you're going to see absolutely nothing because the water, the backscatter just gets lit with the light. So then you have to be very careful about how much backlight and how you fill carefully, even if it's night, because there's no way working around the visibility of the water. So those are the things that go into it. Of course, Anis gets into the actor training, which is a really key part because, it's not that they're holding their breath. Which people think. They're holding their breath, they go down the shot and they come back. That's not how it works really. They have a lot of scuba training. He trains them to the storyboard shots. So they're trained underwater, they take off their gear, we roll camera, they do the shot. At the end of it, he puts back the air on them and then they stay there because it's too stressful on the body to keep going up and down all the time. So that's the actor training and that level of it. So it's a painful, slow process. But the more prep that we do on an underwater shoot, and we become very anal about it because we're the only team around. And so what it's done is given us a very, very good discipline and rigor of prep time. We ask for it and we get it because without that, it's not possible.
Of course. And how difficult is it? Because I actually honestly don't know any other underwater DP right now in Bombay at least. How difficult is it for somebody to sort of go in, and what is the training one would need if they were keen on pursuing it?
So what we've tried to do, interestingly, there are two kinds of underwater crew that we have. Some come straight directly from Anis, who are they're from the diver end of it, which are some of them have, they've trained in commercial diving, some of them are just trained with him, and they're advanced divers, they're instructors. So those are all the safety divers that come in because the actor safety is paramount. Our safety is paramount as well. Because we also so that's Anis's side of the crew that kind of comes in, which are divers, and they're there for all of the safety stuff. Some of them have a certain amount of film background, maybe a little bit here and there. Then there's a kind who one is trying to bring into the fold, which is the cinematography people. So my assistant Sajid as well, he went and trained by himself because he was really keen on it. So he's a diver as well. Then we have Shamsher, who's a Whistling Woods graduate as well. So he's a focus puller underwater. So we try to do the cinematography diver bunch, which is to get the technical crew on. And it's a really slow process, because very few people actually want to do this and commit to doing it. And then we have the other lot. So that's what it pretty much takes.
And what is the communication like? Because if the lights are practically coming from outside the water, how is all the communication happening between the crew outside and inside?
So what we do have is we have this we have this talkback system where we have a speaker underwater and they have a comm system above the water. So the director has feed, they have a video assist, they can communicate with us and we can hear them. So what we do is we've devised very simple sign language whereby we can, because we discuss everything beforehand anyway, we really go through the rigor of preparing everybody. So we use a lot of sign language underwater, good and bad, depends on what we need. How we communicate. We do also have underwater lights, by the way. I know you said above water lights. We do have underwater lights.
But those are practically just to sort of fill the face and stuff, or you could do like major light, proper lighting with it?
No, we can, it's just barely to fill. Also, it looks more and more as one has done it. Underwater lights look artificial. There's no motivation for it. There's no reason. So unless there is a reason to fill, so for fill, it's fine. And we have enough for that. Even then, I prefer to do it from outside the water because now with digital sensors and the way we've actually figured out how to rig lights, it does percolate and permeate enough. You want to get a little eye light, a little detail on the side is all that I choose to use it for, because otherwise it just looks damn odd. Because what happens with lights is wherever you position it, because of the visibility of the water and the clarity, you see the source of the light. So it just starts looking very odd.
Of course. Okay. Yeah. And so now this other thing, so you're a DP, you're an underwater DP, and you own and run a studio, Ellora Studio. So how do you manage all of this? Like how much time does Ellora take up from you?
So every day I'm not shooting, I'm in the studio. It pretty much takes up all my time. So between the two, I sometimes don't even get weekends. Because for some reason, when we're shooting in Bombay, if it's outdoors, you're shooting on weekends because that's how people schedule shoots. So if it's advertising, on a long form job, obviously you're away for a long time. But I'm traveling for 4 hours a day when I'm not shooting, going to the studio and back. Takes up a lot of my time, but I can't complain. It's lovely. I love it.
And so now, what has been your, most memorable underwater shooting experience?
Gosh, every underwater shoot is just always fraught with so many challenges. And it's like a puzzle that you have to solve from the minute you walk on to the end. And in the last year, we've done some really interesting jobs because I think the more people are seeing underwater shoots, the more they're writing it in and they're writing more elaborate sequences in. So it's allowing us to to experiment a lot. We did one very interesting shoot for this Telugu film called Saira with Chiranjeevi, which was a long shoot. It was a submerged temple, and he goes in there. There's this whole action sequence. So the challenge in those sequences is that I always try to get the footage from them very, very, and I do insist on this, the head and tail of where the sequence is going to fit in. And the challenge really is to slip in the underwater without anyone noticing that it wasn't at the same location. So that's where the sleight of hand and the guile comes in of trying to make sure that you don't suddenly realize, oh, swimming pool. Because 90% of the jobs that we do are in a pool because we choose to do it in a pool. Because of
more control.
Huh. Yeah, more control. It's like a studio. We can shoot an 8-hour day without the sun shifting everywhere. You can light it properly. You can set it up properly. So that's what we do.
And now coming to the films that you've shot. The 3 films, to your credit, they're all very varied. Like Bara Ana is like a indie, it's very shot in an indie film manner versus Airlift versus Chef. They're all they look so different, and it's all with the same director for you. So what have your briefs been on each of the films, and how have you gone about prepping for each of them with Raja?
So I think we take our cue very, very clearly from what the script is, like everyone does. But I think that's where the beginning point is, right? Always. And I think it's not that Bara Ana was shot in an indie manner. It was as indie could get. We barely had any money to make the film, which is why a lot of decisions when indie films look a particular way, it also is because that is what your resources are. It was shot on 16mm, Super 16 back in the day. And but I think the beauty of shooting a small film like that, which is indie, when you don't have other compunctions, is we broke it down so well in terms of what our requirements are, because you don't have the luxury of having anything additional on set, as you can imagine. But the days that we needed things like balloon lights, we could still get them in. because you've broken it down and there's no producer sitting on your head saying, no, do it with some, do it with less, can't you do it? So you still got to do. So I don't think there was any decision in that felt indie to me in terms of it was a compromise in the way I had shot it. I pretty much shot it.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
But it's just that Bara Ana is so real.
Yeah.
Versus, Chef.
Yeah.
Versus Chef, which is the gloss that a regular Bollywood film calls for.
So I think that's interesting because I think that was part of the design of it. And I think when I came off Airlift and we went into prep on Chef like within 6 months, and that we are very aware that Chef it was meant to be a ride. You're there for the journey. It's a beautiful journey. It better look beautiful. We're not here. I keep saying we're not here. We who shoot films and things like that, we're not recording reality. We're here to make a cinematic reality, and there is something to heighten in that and to make it in a particular story. And I'm taking Chef as an example. So the idea was a heightened sense of reality, which is a slightly happy world. It's slightly very fluid. Even the camera work, what I tried to do with it, even the taking of it, is kind of accidental. It almost felt like it just is grabbed. It's not really structured and staged, because that was in my mind what I felt like that kind of story required. It required a little bit of Bollywood gloss. So,
and I want to know a little bit about your Airlift action sequences and stuff. What have you shot Airlift on? Which camera have you shot that on?
Alexa with Cook S4Is.
Is Alexa your go-to camera?
Completely. I don't know anything else.
So
I'm a camera gal.
So, how was the whole setup? What was the planning that went behind all the action sequences in Airlift?
So, in the action sequences, I think what drove how we designed the action sequences, because they are similar in one level, but they're actually very different from each other in the way they are structured, is that the conversation that happened was that the action should unfold in real time. We weren't trying to do a glorified kind of very, heightened action sequence. It wasn't very gratuitous. It wasn't high speed. That was a very, very deliberate decision not to make it slowed down in particular shots. There's no ramping, none of that. It was meant to unfold in real time. And the reason that we thought about it like that was that in our minds, that when you see something happening in front of you, and forget action, anything, like any very quick action that happens in front of you, it's after the event that you actually realize what has happened. It's not during the event that you actually have any cognizance of how it is happening and, broken down. So we said, let's take that as our brief, and because we believe that would be an interesting way to do it and the correct way to do it. So that is what we held on to very, very strongly. No,
I think that's what had that. It had a great impact. Just the fact that you guys shot it and it looked real time.
Yeah, and that was, no ultra artificial camera angles, no putting the camera on the ground and one wheel coming and screeching into frame, none of that. And it always unfolded from the point of view of what was happening in the scene at that moment. So even if, there's an act, let me bring up one because that comes to mind, because is when Nimrat runs up to her balcony and she hears gunshots and she opens the window and she sees the street outside and she sees that there's soldiers have overrun, some cars happening, someone's getting shot. And we actually held on to that idea that we are going to see it from a point of view. Now, where we were actually shooting it from a balcony in Russell Khaimah. It was a 100mm lens. And we just went for it. And we're like, we'll shoot it in 2 lenses just for pacing and timing. But we're going to shoot this in 1 shot and we're going to cover it there. And you have your heart in your mouth because you're like, maybe this won't hold because, man, we've set up this whole street. We should be in the middle of it. We should be shooting sections of it and just, nichodoing every bit of it. The producer was probably having a heart attack because we didn't do any of that. But we held on to that thought and that belief that let's see it from where it's meant to be seen. And that's what we tried to do in every sequence. You see it from where you're meant to see it. So it flows seamlessly in the flow of where it's sitting.
And Airlift had a bit of a warm tinge to it. Was it a great thing or was it a on-camera and lighting thing?
It was not a lighting thing so much as it was a large production design and grade thing. And I think which is where this earlier conversation that's also come up on IWCC is where production design actually sits for cinematography. Mustafa was the production designer, and I think what he did with it is we had worked all of the look out obviously beforehand, everything, and even costumes, everything was designed and it fit quite tightly. But a large part of the lead into lighting also and the tone came from the production design. And then when we went into the grade, I had this one photograph actually, which was from Kuwait in that time. It was shot on Kodak stock. It was a still photograph. And I took it to Rob Lang, who's my colorist. And he's like, okay. And I'm not a big reference worker. I don't sit and refer films, and I really don't do that. It's normally, most often for me, my referencing will be a photograph or a painting or something like that. I seem to react to that much better. And I showed him one picture, and I was like, let's do this. This is it. Because it just came upon me one day, and it happened after the shoot. It was not something before. Because the tone also, it is warm, but there's like a coolness in the shadows, and we really worked on it without making it over-processed. But we found the look from a still photograph of that time exactly.
And there's another question I missed while we were talking about your underwater work. The job of a focus puller. Are they underwater focusing with you, or they're above water, assuming how close or far you are from an actor?
Well, my underwater focus puller is someone called Shamsher Rajwar, and he's a savant. I don't understand how he does his job. I have no idea how someone can be floating right next to me in the water while I'm moving, while the actor's moving, and while he's moving, and pull focus, crack, and get it completely sharp to be projected onto a big screen film every time. I don't understand how this works. I don't think I could ever do it. So most of the time we pull focus underwater. What we've started doing now also is sometimes we pull focus from outside, where my other focus puller, which I don't understand how he does it either, because he's looking at the monitor while we are moving in strange manners underwater without rehearsals. So he pulls focus as well. So yeah, we do either or depending on what is required.
And what are your favorite lenses that you? I mean, what are the lenses that you like to work with?
So it again depends. I think lenses are like paintbrushes, right? It depends on what is required. So on Airlift and Chef, I worked with Cook S4Is both the times because I wanted that Cook look, for lack of any other word, and I just love them. I know them. I know Cook lenses. I understand them well. I know what it's going to do. I know how the background reacts. So it's like my comfort lens. Alexa and Cook is something that I keep going back to when all else fails and I don't know what to do. What I've really been enjoying experimenting with recently in advertising, at least, is Master Primes and sorry, not Master Primes, with LF and
LFs.
Yeah, with the LFs and the Signature Primes. Sorry. So been doing a lot of work shooting with the Signature Primes but cosmetic work, which is interesting. I shoot it at barely 2 feet. So shooting very wide lenses, very pushed, very in, to see the fall off and understand how this whole system works. So right now this is my obsession, and I try to go it into every commercial. Now I think those times are gone. We're going to be shooting commercials on iPhones. So.
And what about say when you're on an underwater job, because everyone knows it entails so much and it's like an unseen world for most people. When you say that you need an hour to set it up, they'll be like, okay, take an hour, because it's complicated to shoot underwater. But when you're a DP on set and people can see lights moving and you're putting the camera in place, is there a different speed that one needs to work with, and do people expect different things out of you above and underwater?
Oh, of course, obviously. Underwater, above water, you're expected to fly through the day. And I think the more experience you have, you can kind of work faster and faster. And I think that's something we all strive towards because we understand budgets and things like that. The luxury of having days to pre-light and all are gone. So the faster you are, the better. And I like to work fast actually above water. I just find that when you're working, especially on narrative work, when you keep breaking the pace in between the day to light and break it, I think the thought and the actors get completely rattled. So and for me, I find that just that slowing down of pace very, very tiresome, and it takes away my focus as well. So I work extremely fast above water. And underwater takes time because it just is laborious. And it's not about taking an hour underwater. We ask for a day underwater or 2 days. And we get it. We get pretty much all of it because once they realize what is required, it's always a fight. Because we don't have it, we can't do this. Then they'll compromise. Then you'll add a day later because it's not something that we can rush through. we can't physically move any faster. It's not safer for us to move faster. We have a certain number of hours we can work. There's a, there is a physical risk to this job. So more and more people are understanding. I think the more senior you get as well, you throw your weight around, it helps.
True that. And tell me one thing, like when we're shooting outdoors, I mean, of course, when you go underwater, if you're shooting a whole day of underwater, you're practically in there from morning till evening, and the light changes through the day. Like when we're shooting above water, of course, we'll skim and match and all of that. How do you manage this change in light underwater?
So we do the same thing pretty much. It's just our tools are very, very different. So what you could take above water, which is a skimmer, and just fly it in and skim the light as you're talking. In underwater, because you have nowhere to put stands, because there is this huge water body in the middle, we do the same stuff, but what we use is like one stand for above water is an industrial crane for underwater. So our gear is all massive. Like we'll have on any given day, most often 2 industrial cranes. We'll probably build 40 by 40 grids with like double silks on them or whatever you want to do, pull them in, then fly them in above the thing. Even if you're lighting, that's the size of, even if you've got one person underwater, you need to light the entire water body. So that's the size of all this stuff. It's very, very, so underwater for the kind of work that we do, which is basically feature film work, it's quite expensive because it requires this size and scale for it to look believable. And you can do it at nothing, then it looks like nothing also. There's no way around this. It just is one of those things.
And you did mention earlier that you take actors underwater to sort of prep them for the shoot and stuff. But are real rehearsals happening? Is the director present when you're doing all of this in terms of how long does the shot need to be, how much they need to move, all of that in terms of the shot breakdown and stuff?
So sometimes the director's there and we do an entire tech rehearsal day where we actually literally go through the entire motions. We shoot off with doubles, sometimes with the actor, it depends. They'll cut it together because also for directors sometimes it's very hard to understand, and for action underwater to understand the pacing of it, because you've got water. So you're saying, okay, I want to shoot this 48 frames, but in water it looks like 72 and then the action may not look effective at all. So it takes a little while to understand what movement looks like underwater, any kind of movement. So most often we do rehearsal days. Even if it's not with the director, we will shoot it off and then, edit will cut it and then the director will see it, they'll change stuff. But the more prep that we do before and the more things are clear, the faster the shoot, because each shooting day is underwater is very expensive. So it's much better to just prep all this out and then get on the shoot.
And like you have multiple options in cameras, do you have multiple options in your hydro bodies as well, or not so much?
Yeah. We can take we have only one housing, which is the Hydroflex housing, but we can put anything from a Phantom to a Red to a Sony Venice. We can put Alexa. Any camera can go into that. So camera options are enough. The housing is one, but it takes everything. So we're good.
Somebody just asked a question. Have you ever been offered a complete feature underwater?
No. Somebody was talking about it, but these things are so expensive that most often they don't end up happening. So even on international jobs that one gets a call, what ends up happening is that you do half dry for wet. We also,
what is dry for wet?
Where you actually shoot in a studio against green screen, take away my job and shoot in the normal DP. And you just shoot it. You shoot at high speed, you do all the water caustics and all of that, because at the end of the day, to shoot an underwater feature, the level of commitment and training you're going to require from every person is incredible. And which budget will afford it, what kind of film, it's a hard one to make. So, no.
And does lensing change for you? Obviously it does, but in what way, the over and underwater lensing?
So lensing underwater, what ends up happening is water is like a magnifier, a magnifying glass. So you take a rule of thumb is about 25% is what every lens gets magnified by. Even focus changes because your focal plane also, if it's like, say, let me take 3 feet and 4 feet because that's about 25%. So if it is 3 feet on the lens, from inside the lens, inside the housing to the person, you put 4 feet on the barrel. So we recalibrate all our focus rings to do that, where you have to change it by 25%. So 25% is kind of a rule of thumb for all lensing. It gets magnified. The other thing about lensing also, what is interesting underwater is one tries to shoot on the wider end of lenses. Because the longer the lenses go, the more the water body between you, the camera, and the object. And the more the water body, and if you have depth of field, which is whatever it is, you've got that much of mushy out of focus water between you and the. So, which is why sometimes underwater work might have sharpness on the focus, but it just generally doesn't look like there's no brilliance in, and the brilliance comes from the fact that you've got all this out of focus water in between. So you have to be very, very careful about what lens you use for what. And the wider, the better, and push in closer. When you feel like you're getting too much distortion, then you can pull back. But it's always better to go closer.
Somebody just asked, have you shot the song Duba Duba Rehta Hoon?
No, dude, I'm not that old.
Okay. So tell me what, in terms of, in airlift, did you do most of the action yourself, or did you have action DP to shoot the stuff? You know why I'm asking you that question?
Of course, because girls don't shoot action.
You're a girl, can you shoot action?
I'm a girl, how do I shoot action? When I get tired. Yeah, well, you got the answer to the question. Of course I shot it myself. But that question has come up so many times. Yeah. So, yeah. I can walk, I can stand like any other man. I can hold a camera. So that's all one requires. Like, what else are we really doing?
Now, tell me, whenever you set up, whenever you're shooting, obviously you have a look at your final look in mind. So do you sort of work with LUTs on set, or do you just work with the Rec 709 and then let your DI artist do the rest of the job?
So that's interesting, because the other day when we were talking to Mehek also in the chat, I asked that question because it's something I still struggle with. I still work with the Rec 709 because finally after all these years, I've begun to understand how the Rec 709, actually the compression of it, what it's doing to color, contrast, saturation, and how much to disregard on set, and what I'm going to get when I take that into a grading suite. We don't have the luxury of live grade yet. I haven't had it. So I've begun to now understand exactly what Rec 709 does and what I can do with it later. So far I'm finding that I stick to that. I did try to do a couple of LUTs on set. What ended up happening is then I didn't know where my base was. I didn't have something to anchor towards. I was like, okay, so now is that LUT making the contrast less, or am I didn't know where that was happening. So I just find it far better at the moment that I stick with Rec 709, because I know what I then can get into the grading suite, work with a colorist, and then push the look forward.
And, it's complicated enough shooting people with different skin tones above water. When you're dealing with the same thing underwater, or if you're shooting like a dark-skinned person, and you're working with a certain amount of light coming in, is there anything that one needs to sort of keep in mind?
Yeah, what happens with water again is as you go deeper into the water, you start losing all your short wavelengths, all your reds go away, and it gets blue and blue, as we've all seen.
Mm-hmm.
So certain skins reflect a lot of blue, other skins don't. So suddenly you've got two people standing in the same frame underwater, and you see them above and there's absolutely no issue. And you go down and one is just looking like ghostly blue and the other one is looking completely normal. So it's a bit hard because we don't have that much control underwater to sit and light that carefully each and every person. The thing is to be aware of it, and when you realize what to do with it, then you can generally fix it, and then later on try and find a separation. Yeah, but skin is it's a huge surprise underwater. It just starts doing the strangest things because everyone's skin has, and the minute you take away the red, everyone's skin starts reacting very differently.
And is the makeup different underwater? Because there are all these glossy songs and stuff that happen in water now and stuff, and the blush stays in place and the mascara stays in place, and
yeah, they have waterproof makeup. They put waterproof makeup, and that is very effective, and I think it works very, very well. Sometimes what happens is we'll go down and I look at the actor or the actress, come back and tell the makeup artist, no, this is not working. Now to compensate for what is happening, which is the blue or the there's something happening with the skin tone, can we come out and provide a solution for it? So now what started happening is, because I can see it much clearer and easier, I can tell them how to correct it, and then we come back and we can continue shooting, to answer your question actually. So sometimes we try and correct the makeup for it, but it's hard to pick, it's very hard to pick and realize what the problem is. But I guess, it's a thing with experience again that you figure out that you can kind
And
of.
are there, I mean, of course, films come with their own looks and colors and stuff, but when you're shooting something, is there certain colors that you would tell a director to avoid or the costume designer to avoid underwater? Something that doesn't react very well once, I mean, if you're shooting it in water?
So it depends on what the entire setup is, right? So if it's day, if it's night, if it's hard light, soft light, what the background is. So once we see the entire environment, then absolutely one always has opinions on what colors to use or not use. But it depends on what the entire environment is and what they're trying to communicate. Sometimes it might be like, we want to show this girl in a brilliant red dress and she's going to be 20 feet into the water. And my first thing is that is not going to come through. You're going to get a very crimson, sanguine colored dress because it just goes deeper and deeper and you get much more black. So be aware of it. Are you okay with it? If you're not, then find another thing. But let me tell you, this is what's going to happen. So, yeah.
So when your tests and stuff happen, do they happen with all of this in place? Like you're saying, sometimes you do a rehearsal and all, or not really? You don't have that luxury.
No. But suppose, one realizes that there's going to be a problem with a particular thing. Like I always ask the costumes, ask for all of that stuff. And if one realizes that a particular costume might cause a problem, synthetic materials cause a lot of problems. Because, and it's not only about the color. Sometimes synthetic materials, because of the chlorine in the pool, it starts coming off. And if we're doing a 2 or 3 day shoot, we'll start changing color. So we always do a kind of a test and say, just soak it in water, bring it into the pool, we leave it under the water. We'll just tie it to a cutter stand, leave it there for a few hours and let's see what happens. Because the bleach reacts differently as well.
Of course, yeah. And somebody asked a question, if you were to grade underwater footage also, do you still go with Rec 709 on set?
See, what happens on underwater shoots is there's always, it's a feature shoot most often, right? And we've got the DP there most of the times. And we try and work with whatever they're working on. Whether if they've got a LUT that they're using, I try not to work with a LUT underwater because no one really has enough experience to understand what is going to happen. Now you put some other LUT where you don't really know how light reacts, then, there's too many variables in this whole thing. So it's just better to keep much simpler, just to see a very straight up footage. Because the minute you start tinkering around with it and putting some LUT on, I just find that it's like the ground beneath my feet is getting taken off and I don't have anywhere to anchor this footage. So it's just better to keep it for underwater work especially. Simpler is just better.
Of course, yeah. And what is your crew like underwater? How many people need to go down to get a shot besides the actors? Obviously, there are no touch-up people, nobody else who's going down besides the technical crew and the actor. Correct. So underwater is just the technical crew and the actors, right? So what would your technical crew comprise of?
So the technical crew on any given day would be underwater gaffer, underwater one more assistant, like a lighting assistant, underwater focus puller. So that would be kind of standard. And then over and above, if we have a really big setup, then Anis will of course have his crew, which will be the safety divers and instructors to handle the actors. But we work very, very tight underwater, like what takes 10 people to do. And we do a lot of heavy lifting. We have a lot of stuff underwater. We're moving stands, lights, reflectors, mirrors, but we work with very few people. Firstly, because it requires a lot of expertise. And secondly, it's just like how we would all like our sets to be. You have control over it. Just lesser people, quieter, and you just get the work done a lot faster.
And so you mentioned an underwater gaffer who you didn't bring up earlier. So is there somebody who's trained for underwater gaffing who works with you mostly?
So Sajid, who works with me, went and he's basically graduated from Whistling Woods. He's a DP now, don't write, but he works with me as well. And he went and certified with Anis, finished his underwater training. Now it's been 6-7 years. So it's great for me because he's my assistant as well regularly and he's trained for underwater. So he completely understands how this entire world works. And we have a light meter underwater. He's fully trained. So he sets up all his stuff. He's got if he needs another additional person. So we pretty much work like that underwater.
And earlier on, you had mentioned that there's basically your communication happens through sign language. So if you're behind the camera, how are you really communicating? Because sign language would be right in front of the lens, right? So
you're not communicating when you're rolling camera, right? Even when we're shooting, you're trying to communicate in takes. So you just turn the camera to yourself if you want to say, can you repeat that? Or we have certain signs for okay, one more, things like that. Or we have a slate. I have an underwater slate, so I might write some things on it and show it to them. Yeah, so that's how we communicate with each other, because when you're trying to do technical communication, it's very hard to use sign language. We use sign language. But if I'm, telling Sajid, read that light at whatever, so then I'll just write it down and show it to him. And then that's how we communicate as well. It's very nice, because it's very quiet. And you communicate as much as is necessary. The rest
And you
of
have
the
a
time.
bell? It says you have
Yeah.
a slate and a bell. What does the bell do?
There's a slate and a bell. That's why I call my crew, all my little, just tang, tang, tang. So you have basically it's called a tank banger, and it's a long stick, it's a metal stick, and you just whack it on your tank, and it's the greatest sense of power I've ever had, because you bang it and just lift you and come running.
Oh, lovely. But that's really just for your underwater crew.
Yeah. That's just
You
for them.
only feel like queen underwater.
There's no way to communicate, right? Because there's no words, there's nothing.
Of
So the
course,
only way to get
yeah.
someone's attention is actually the tank banger.
And that sound carries.
It carries through the water. Yeah, completely. And all the men turn.
Sajid's laughing at that.
Yeah.
And do you need, bigger lights to suffice for light underwater, or like the regular 6Ks and stuff are good for you?
From above the water, when we're lighting from above, bigger lights. Because also single sources, right? Because again, when you're shooting on land, you can try and cheat multiple sources and make them look like a single source, because you've got no atmosphere in the air. Imagine if you were shooting above water with a lot of fog and a lot of haze. If you had multiple sources, you would start seeing the source, the form of every source. So the same thing is underwater all the time. So any multiple source that you're trying to cheat even a bit, like suppose I've got some sort of backlight coming and I want a little bit of edge just from here, you'll suddenly see the shaft of light. So the bigger the source, farther away where you actually get the spread of the light is far more effective than trying to cheat it with many, many small sources. Makes it very expensive, which is why underwater.
So it's a given. So if you're doing underwater, it's going to be expensive.
It is going to be expensive because it is in the nature of that shoot.
Okay, I want you to talk about one scene from each of your films, which stands out for you particularly.
Gosh, I haven't seen that in so many years. We'll come back to that. So let's start with Airlift. So in Airlift, there's this one action sequence. Well, it's hardly action because it unfolds at a very slow pace. But Akshay is going home, where he's going to go back, and he has to go through this riot-prone street where there's explosions and fire, and he needs to go and make sure that his wife and child are safe. So we went to the street and we were setting it up in Russell Khema again. We were all there and we were like, okay, we'll do this, we'll shoot it like that, this, that, and the other, and we lost sight of that thought that we had of where do you want to see this action from? And Mustafa just, when you see his sets, you're just salivating because you want to shoot the shit out of it because it's just so much texture and detail, like, you don't want to walk away. And then we were talking, and then Raja and I, we were talking, and we're like, 1 minute, but this is wrong. Where you need to see this from actually is from inside his car, from his point of view, because that's what's important right now. We're not trying to glorify what's happening on the streets. That's not it. It's his insecurity and his sense of feeling trapped in this entire environment, and that's where we need to see it. And again, it's really tricky to do that. And the first question was, how are we going to do this? Because the easy way is to just be handheld in the seat and, operate and shoot it. But the idea was, again, handheld again becomes very subjective. And it was not the idea. I felt like we wanted a far more controlled, very claustrophobic, restrained camera move, although it should do the same thing. And Piyush was on the Jimmy Jib there. So I was discussing this with him, and he just came up with this brilliant adaptation pretty much the night before the shoot. He took off the remote head from the jib, took off the seat from the passenger side, and he rigged up on a little tower. We got grips to do that. And he rigged up the jib remote head in the passenger seat. And he hid behind Akshay under the driver's seat. And then we shot what we thought we were going to just have this glorious shoot. We did 4 takes in the day, I think, and everyone was just in shock because the camera never got out of the car. And we said, this is how we believe it should be seen. And there was a lot of flack that we got for that. Because it's like, the whole thing has been set up. How can you do it in this manner? There's this insecurity also of coverage, right? Which you can understand that. That you need to cover a scene, because if you're doing 1 take and there's something that's wrong in the middle of it, or you want to change the pace, what are you going to do? We had no coverage. We did 5 or 6 takes. in the day because we rehearsed it.
But I think that takes a lot of trust and great collaboration, I think.
Exactly, and I think that's what we have, and which allows us to, do stuff like that. And then you have people who back you, and we had Akshay also who just turned around, who wanted to do this big fat action sequence, but then he just trusted that this was correct for the film. Why he trusted, I have no idea. And we were, there was no reason, but we did it, and I'm very, very proud of that because I think it stood for itself, And it looks like it's high speed, and it isn't actually, because it unfolds in real time, but to be able to stretch time through camera movement, I think it's an interesting texture.
And what about Chef?
There
was a lot of traveling, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of travel, and there's a sense of easy breezy to the whole feel, and kind of effortless. There's a little song in it, where Saif and his wife Padma are dancing in the house, and it came also from necessity a bit, but also from the style, where we just did the entire song in long 360 shots, and not in the traditional 360, but it was this very heady, because it was meant to be, this love and headiness and all of that. And we shot it in these very quick. It was 360 at night in an entire house with we had to rig everything in this Kerala house with practicals, but had to have enough detail everywhere without a single light on the floor. And I think we got quite an interesting look. So nothing else is coming to my mind right now, but that came in. So I thought that was interesting.
Okay, I think we're running out of time. Let's disconnect and reconnect. I have a few more questions for you.
Okay.
So the other question I was actually very keen on asking is that we mentioned that you own and run a studio, Ellora. So when you were setting that up as a DP, what all did you keep in mind? I've shot there, and I know it's a very shooting friendly location, primarily because certain things have been kept in mind.
That's interesting. So I think what I looked at is obviously where one is going to light it from. And I think my biggest fear was that if I go in there to shoot and there's no place for me to put a light where I want to do, then that's going to be pretty crappy. So one designed it like that, honestly. And I think it just comes with experience and having done it enough to know where you would want to put lights, which walls you'd like to have floating. And also with building the sets, what I did realize, which is interesting, is because it's not my area of expertise at all, is changing scale for sets. And we actually did that in a lot of areas. We did a little bit of force perspective for the corridors and things because we didn't have that much area. So we pushed them a bit in. We, in terms of arches and things like that, what it does look like on camera versus what it really did. And, thank God for iPhones and Artemis now that, we have all this. And I would keep framing up all the time while building and say, bring this lower, do that, we can extend this, we can push that. So I think that experience really helped in building it. And it taught me a lot also about, because even when you go on set, when you're shooting for yourself as a DP, we should know these things, because at the end of the day, we must put that into the, this thing about being collaborative with a production designer. So I think it's been a great lesson to do that.
And is there a production designer who's associated with the studio who sort of designs the basic setups?
No, we don't have any production designer. We have an art director who I hire. I pretty much design the sets.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you another thing about this thing. Barana, how many days did you shoot that film in?
I don't know, it's like 10 years ago. Maybe Raja Menon on, somebody can help.
Actually, how is your association with Raja Menon been? Like, what is your whole procedure to prep and stuff? I mean, I understand, see, it's all driven by script and all of that, but there is a way that the director and a DP sort of get going with the project.
So it's driven by it's driven by scripts and drinks. So, I think the good part is when you're working with someone you're friends with, you can really take it off working hours. You're not sitting in an office trying to discuss a script. And I think it really helps. And it's not only about Raja. We have this crew. We've all been working together for so many years. There's Debashish Mishra on sound. There's Mustafa. Who's editing. So we have, sorry, 1 minute. We have a very, very, we've been working together for years. And I think we all approach every film as filmmakers. It's not my department, your department. And we sit and we thrash out every single bit of it. Everyone's open to everyone else's opinion because I think we respect each other as filmmakers. So it starts from there. It starts from the fact that we sit and break it down from all the way in the beginning. So we never really get into this point, Raja and I, later on with any rude surprises about, wait, I didn't even realize this is how you're looking at it. You know, we've gone through all of that. And we have enough time, most of the time, to sit and, because at the end of the day, it's an exchange of ideas. You know, prep and hard prep comes much later. But if you're on the same page and you have the same philosophy about the film, then hopefully that symbiotic relationship should lead into, you know, a simpler prep.
Right. And in terms of ads and stuff, do you have, I mean, do you just take it as it comes, or is there a lot of prep that goes behind the ads and all that you shoot?
I mean, in ads, more and more, one doesn't have the luxury of prep, right? I think you get called on and you go and you do as much prep. And whatever is allowed in that time is what you do. I like to prep generally. I think a lot of us do, because it's just better to be organized. And I think especially when you come from shooting long form work, you're used to the idea of prep and you're used to being, you know, pre-lighting and things like that. And sometimes advertising, you're told to shut up, because it just depends, you know, what advertising allows you to do and how much in detail you can get into it. So that's, you know, where it is. I want to say something interesting, actually. Interesting to me. Advertising, you know, this thing that we constantly, the question comes up about, do we get stereotyped into the kind of work that we do? And we all get stereotyped. You can shoot this kind of film, you can shoot cars, you can shoot action. I shot one action film, you know, so things like that. And it's funny because the kind of films I get stereotyped for and called for is for action and some war and some, you know, outdoorsy kind of stuff. I never get called for love stories. I don't know why. Like, never. I'll never get called for a real Bollywood rom-com. Doesn't happen. When it comes to advertising, I'm stereotyped and shooting skin and hair. So I only get calls for skin and hair. I'll never get called for anything that requires any amount of rigor or any amount of outdoorsy action kind of stuff. So it's just like, you know, it's like you can never win in any situation, because even if you do everything, and I think this is something for all of us, this really myopic view that people who hire you have is, if you've done something once, then that's the only thing you're ever going to get hired for again and again. Just want to throw it in there.
So I'm just going to open the session. If anyone has any questions, let them pop up, and otherwise we'll wrap up the session. What have you been doing in the lockdown?
I bought myself a cleaning robot, as everyone knows.
So you're not doing anything. You're just playing with the robot.
I figured out how to put the camera on the robot and started doing videos today. It's damn exciting. You know, this whole, you know, people who are like, I've read 100 things and I've watched 2,000 things. My mind does not focus, and I've learned to accept that and just take it a day at a time, and not have so many expectations of yourself. Just take it easy, and I think just going through this lockdown is rigor enough.
And I mean, while we're waiting for any questions to pop up, is there, I mean, a certain DP whose work you like and sort of get inspired by or follow?
I think recently what I've been looking at, and I like the heightened style of, is Brad Young. I think I really enjoy what he's doing and how he's doing it. So that's interesting to me. You know, there's so much interesting work happening, and there's so much good work, and it's on series work, it's on films that, like, to my mind right now, off the ball, nothing, but there's a very nice new style to work, which is interesting to see. So yeah, nobody in particular at the moment.
Somebody has a question. In your opinion, do you feel going to a film school is necessary, or learning on the job is good enough?
I think it's not an either or. I think there are merits to both. I didn't go to film school, so I can't answer that question. I think the good part about going to film school would have been, I think, is the network. And I don't mean network in a bad way, but I think to have that camaraderie and to have that group of people who you've sort of worked with and grown with, I think it's quite valuable. And I'm getting a little sense of that in IWC, which is why I enjoy it so much, is because we have that. And it is like film school in some way, where you have a bunch of people who have your back and you can exchange ideas and thoughts. People are working with each other, generating work, sharing knowledge. So to me, that is the important part of it.
And you must have seen such a big change, because you mentioned when you started off, there were barely any women doing this, and now just look at the numbers that we have.
Exactly, right? We have all of, I think, 0.5% of male DPs. I mean, we're growing. We barely have, I think, 140 or something like that in the whole country. I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe Fauzia has more details on that. but it's still abysmally low. It's still so very, very low. And I think still when each one of us walks on set, I don't think any woman DP has not had that comment coming, oh my God, it's so nice to see a woman on set. So I think till those comments stop, there won't be enough women.
True that. I think it needs to be as normal as a male DP walking in. It shouldn't be an unusual thing.
Exactly. You know, so I think we're still a ways away from that. And yeah.
And just to wrap up the session, one funny incident that might have happened with you, or a big error that might have happened with you underwater.
Underwater. I can give you an error that happened above water. And
okay, tell me.
Our Raja, he's probably, if I don't tell the story, he'll tell the story. So it was my first, we were shooting some music video in Goa on 35. I was really new. We went there, it was a 7-day shoot. That time we still saw music videos on 35mm. We set up our camera. We were shooting some shot of this guy walking and some birds flying. Early morning, yeah, we've got it. Sun is rising behind the mosque. Pigeons are flying. Man is crossing. We do the take and I cut it. And he's like, okay, got it. Moving on. And he's like that. 1 take, 2 takes, and we're on. We had not even met each other till that morning of the shoot because we didn't have time to prep. Nothing. It was just. And after 2 minutes, I was like, can we do one more, please? So he's like, no, I got it. It's perfect. It was great. I said, no. I forgot to compensate for the ND, for the Pola, I just didn't do anything. I was so nervous. And it was on 35 that I just completely blanked out and just shot some, I think 4 stops undershot. And he was like, and he always narrates the story. And he goes, and I was like, I've got a 7-day shoot coming up with her. This is going to be really interesting. Let's move this forward.
Yeah, actually, it was different back then. On film, you had to. It was all judgment. Like with digital, exactly. It's so much easier now. You just know what you're getting.
And if you're not seeing the frame, the spot boy is telling you if it's underexposed. I mean, there are enough people on set.
Totally.
Exactly. So and I think it was just nerves as well, right? You're just not even looking clearly. I was like so nervous. It was the first day on shoot. That was my brilliant beginning with Raja Menon. I think he regrets it ever since, but I think it's alright.
So what are you working on right now? What's coming up next for you?
Well, everything that we're working on has all been pushed back, right?
Of course. After the lockdown, is something in the pipeline?
Start a show actually. We were supposed to be shooting from May onwards, and obviously it's been called off. Your guess is as good as mine, and then get on to a feature after that. But now when one begins and when it ends and when the next thing begins is anyone's guess. I did one commercial, which was a remote commercial the other day.
Oh yes, please talk about that.
Yeah, that was quite interesting actually, because what happened, this is in the first days of remote actually, it wasn't now where everyone's doing it. What we had ended up doing is, it was a Dettol commercial. It was shot in Bahrain and we had set up remote feed in my apartment. And I pretty much had the camera frame set up in front of me. We had 2-3 monitors. I had my iPad, I had a computer, and I had my phone. And we had set up so I got live camera feed. I had another camera which had been set up, which gave me like a far wider view of the set. We had 2-3 of those, which had been set up to give you where the lighting was. Then we had poor Sajid for 8 hours a day for 2 days on headphones with the camera operator and the DP there actually. And he was instructing him how to light and what readings we wanted off each light, where to bounce it. So it was excruciatingly slow. And then after each take, we would get an immediate frame grab, which was graded there. We had set up, they would set up a LUT. They would send us the frame. After every take, we would look at it, approve it, then go on to the next shot. So it was very, very slow to achieve. Like, I think, we would have finished this commercial in...
You were meant to be there on the shoot, and because of the lockdown, you couldn't be there? How did this
No, it was designed like... It was designed as a remote shoot. I was hired to sit in my house and monitor the shoot. And we had a DP there who was a local DP, because they were working with 12 people crews at that time. So he was very nice, and he was absolutely generous in taking instructions from us. So it was designed like that. It was designed as a remote shoot, and there was somebody there who did this entire system. So it worked out really well, and they came back to Bombay, and then we did a remote grade in Bombay. And that worked out well as well. So it was quite interesting, but I think as DPs, the frustrating part of this whole thing is having to sit on a chair and look at a laptop. I mean, this is not what we do. It's the extreme of what we do. So, I keep getting up and was shifty and fidgety. So I understand what office people feel like or what editors feel like, but it's just not for me. I'm grateful to have had the experience, but yeah, it's not easy.
And is there a good exposure to work with underwater? Like, is there a certain exposure you like working with?
Yeah. Not
For
anything less than,
sharpness and
yeah, 5.6 at least, because one needs a certain depth of field, because people move. Everyone, I'm moving also. Even if I'm breathing, I'm moving. The characters are moving. So at least about a 5.6 is good underwater. For night, 5.6 is a bit hard, so around 4, but not more open than that. It just it's
but which means you do end up using NDs if you were shooting outdoors.
Underwater.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah, we use NDs underwater. Yeah. Light doesn't penetrate that much. So even if you've got a big 24K sitting on a crane, by the time it reaches and gets down there, you've got about that much. And you'll say, most often you'll shoot something at 48 frames or 50 frames. So you've got to stop there. So by the end of it, net, you've pretty much reached a 5.6 half. It's not that you've got that much light coming in.
And when you're shooting outdoor, I mean, you're shooting underwater stuff with actors, does a lot of it happen in live locations or mostly just pools?
So see, with actors, most often in pools, because firstly, I think it's a safety thing with actors and it's an insurance thing with actors as well. You're going to take them out into the deep sea, they're not well trained. That becomes one part of it. But secondly, for us also, as much as I would love to fly off to Mauritius and shoot underwater in the sea, and it's just not viable. It's hard to do. You've got currents moving. Where are you going to anchor yourself? Every time, if you're in the sea and I want to settle down, even if it's a shallow bed, I'm going to raise sand, and then sand will fly, and the visibility of the water is going to go. So, and with VFX coming, if you've got a decent VFX setup, and they're going to come in and replace the background, it's just far more controlled. So, as much as the travel has gone out of the window for underwater. Otherwise, you would travel a lot and shoot in exotic places. But now, more and more, because the shoots are getting quite complicated, we prefer to just base in a swimming pool, just execute it, and then hand it over to VFX, because it ends up having a lot of VFX because you're replacing backgrounds. You're creating layers.
Because back in the day when I had done one shoot with you for My Name is Khan, though we did it in a pool, but we had sort of made the water murky and we had put in all these props and all because it was a flood that had happened. So when you're shooting, what do you prefer? That do you shoot in clear water and everything happens in VFX, or if something needs to be murky, would you like to shoot it in murky water?
So what happened after your shoot actually is, because that water was so dirty, I felt so sick for I think a month and a half that I was so scarred by that bloody shoot that after that I told Anisha, we will never do a dirty water shoot again. We will shoot in clean water. Let them figure this out. And that was a huge learning and a huge turning point for me to realize how much of dirty water one can actually bear. You just forget about all of it. Like, I'll be in there. I'm going to shoot this. It's horrible. So there's a limit on dirty water when we choose to shoot now, the learnings. And post also, they prefer it. See, if there's any VFX work required, they would rather you shoot in clean water and they can do it because they can control it. I also would prefer that, firstly for the sense of my own safety and for the crew. Secondly, for control. If the water's clean, one knows how much. When you're going to dirty it, who's going to decide how much? Then art department will throw in too much of something. Then the filtration will stop working. So it's just better to shoot it slightly cleaner, and then they can, muddy it, and they do a fine job of it. So that,
of course, yeah. And do you have a constant team that you work with, and are your teams different for above and underwater?
Well, the constant is my focus puller above water and Sajid who work with me above and under, and my lighting team, of course. My gaffer is the same, and then of course the additions underwater is Anis's team where they get added. But I try and work with the same team. Like in the beginning, it was always, every feature shoot, they'd be like, can you work with our crew underwater because we're already working with them. And then you have to teach them from scratch because underwater really is a whole other beast. So now I find it easier and it makes sense for everybody because the work is faster that you work with my people because they understand how to do this. There's so much of rigor required, the prep required. There's a safety issue as well, the
and
cables.
Communication.
And cabling and things like that. I was electrocuted on one shoot once because we were shooting. Actually, I was taking a shot from outside the surface, and it was an underwater shoot. But they said, "Can you just take this one shot? Some explosion happens and some squib they put in the water, and it's going to blow." And they had put non-waterproof squibs in a plastic theli and put them underwater, and the current just carried into my legs into the camera and just threw me back. So we don't have safety in this country, so we just do whatever goes. So now, as much as I can control the crew I work with, make sure we solve these things because I want to live for more than one underwater shoot.
And one more thing I wanted to ask you is, see, when you're shooting above water and the clouds come in, they go off, you're shooting on a bad weather day. One still keeps shooting, you pump in a few extra lights and stuff. What happens underwater?
Budget dependent. If we can wait, we'll wait it out. If you can't wait, then you try and pump it in and try and match it in post. I mean, the same thing you're going to try and do. It is all eventually what the ideal scenario is not what we can always do. It is really budget dependent and time dependent. So sometimes you have to just swallow it and continue working and try and match it as much as you can. And other times you get away with it. I mean, other times you have the luxury of waiting. So it just depends.
Right. And Manish, who's a DP, he had a question. He's saying that a lot of the above water stuff gets documented and stuff. There's making happening and all of that. Does any of that happen underwater as well? Is there any documentation of the shoot underwater really?
Well, Anees has a whole bank of underwater stuff, but what happens is most often we're not allowed to share that because it belongs to various producers. And these are feature jobs and they're with big actors and things like that. So very, very rarely does any of the underwater work get out because this is also stuff that sometimes maybe they don't want to show. They don't want people to know how it's done. So, and we don't get to release a lot of this work. So when the producers release it is the only time that one gets to show this work. So it's all there. It's just, yeah.
So even after the project is out, it's not okay for you guys to sort of release this kind of footage for people to watch?
No, you have to take permission from the producers. You have to get something signed off from them. And if they're okay with it, then they allow you to do it. Otherwise, you don't get to do it. Whatever they release is okay. Otherwise, it's not.
Okay. Chalo, it's been great talking to you, Priya.
It was an
let's connect soon.